Hi, welcome to this episode of Reinvent the University for the Whole Person. My name is Randy Bass, and I'm the Vice Provost for Education at Georgetown University. And Georgetown is very pleased to be partnering with Reinventors to bring you this 6-episode Roundtable series in which we can explore the way of reconsidering higher education for the whole person as we move into the future. And so we're very excited. This is the 2nd episode of a 6-episode series. We have a great group of people we've assembled today, and I'll introduce them in a moment. Today, we're focusing on the question of the next skill set for the future, thinking about the skill set or the outcomes for the whole person. And by this, we really want to ask, what is the future demand of universities in the kind of graduates that we want to produce? What are the skills, what are the abilities, maybe even values that we want to cultivate in learners that will be prepared for the future? So that really is the question that we want to dive deeply around today. In our first episode, 2 weeks ago, it was anchored by Salim Ismail from Singularity University. We looked at the question of the whole opportunity of the future. What kind of future are we looking at? What are the complexities? What do we mean by the whole person? And how do we think universities should start to respond to that? And in talking about that, we agreed that, and I'll just throw out some terms that really form the basis for today's conversation, that we were moving into a future that was going to be accelerating around the pace of change. That the most important thing that we could do would be to educate students to learn how to learn how to be adaptable, to be agile, to learn how to collaborate, to learn how to network, to be able to adjust to continuously changing conditions. We talked in terms of a shift from education systems to learning systems. And by that, I think we meant that we're not any longer just talking about institutions that are meant to impart content, but that we are talking about a much larger system of learning in which universities have something to contribute that's very particular, universities or colleges, but the universities can no longer think of themselves as islands, but that they're actually quite porous and quite fluid with a much larger learning system in our culture, and that has everything to do with how we imagine reinventing ourselves. So it's really in this context of teaching people how to learn, how to adapt, how to be agile, how to be connected, and in helping to think about how universities can respond to this context. But today, we want to dive more deeply into the question of skill sets or outcomes. To do that, we have assembled 6 fabulous people to help us explore this topic. We have our anchor, Don Harward, the President Emeritus of Bates, who helped set up the series with a talk and a video that's online available. We have Mike McPherson, who's the President of the Spencer Foundation, former President of Macalester College. We have Mimi Ito, who is a cultural anthropologist and media theorist who has helped to produce a series of very valuable reports over the last few years about this, what we might call the new ecology of learning. We have Nova Spivack, who is the CEO of Bottlenose, which is a data mining and trend analysis firm. And we have Peter Felten, who's the Assistant Provost and the Director of the Center for Engaged Learning at Elon University, as well as from our partner Reinventors, Nicole Boyer. So it's a terrific group of people, and we're looking forward to the conversation. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today, and thank you to you. So let's start by just sort of setting the foundations and kind of coming back at our definition of the concept of the whole person and what we mean by the whole person, and especially starting to get a shared definition of what the skill set of the whole person might be. And we mean skills very broadly here to really mean just the outcomes. What are the traits? What are the kinds of things that we would want to associate with someone who's being educated as a whole person to be effective in a whole range of settings. And Don Harward really helped set this up by giving us a very full sense of the purpose of higher education. And I want to begin by directing a question to Don and then opening up to the panelists. In this conversation, we really want to take up three challenges around the skill set. What we're calling the civic challenge, the technology challenge, and the equity challenge. So let me start with the civic challenge, because the concept of the civic is something that Don has thought deeply about and is editing a multi-volume set of books on the question of civic education. And I'd like Don to maybe just talk a little bit about your concept of the civic. You don't mean it narrowly, like just about politics or civic action or just civility. You really use the term civic to mean the highest purposes of education. So I wonder if you could just start us off by elaborating a little bit on how you understand the concept of the civic.
Thanks, Randy, and thanks for allowing me to be a part of this very interesting venture. I guess I quickly to characterize what I think is sort of the major argument that I tried to provide in the video, and perhaps can use that as a quick setup to answer your question. I think that the nature of the argument about thinking about reinventing higher education, that the basic and reinventing higher education with some integrated vision, begins, for me at least, in formulation of developing a compelling case for the purposes of higher education, the unique combination of purposes for higher education. And I think in doing that, which includes the civic, as well as obviously the epistemic, the learning component, and it includes attention to preparing for participation, in a work environment and an environment that has worth. And it, of course, also includes what might be called the eudaimonic purpose or the well-being purpose. It's in the full development of that set of purposes that are a necessary condition, I think, for understanding what we want to achieve as the skill sets or outcomes in the future. So I think the first step is to sort of understand the interaction of those elements, and which I'll say a bit about and quickly about the civic. But it's from that interaction that I think we have a chance of altering the conversation, the predominant conversation about the purpose and utility of higher education. And that's what I think we want to get at. By altering the conversation, I think we can thereby alter expectations of those within the higher education and expectations of parents and the public in general. And I think it's through altering expectations that we can generate changes in the priorities and the matters of curriculum and pedagogy and structure and being clear about objectives. And I think in changing making those changes, we'll have an opportunity to do what you want to do in this series of addressing the fundamental crises, the current crises and the future crises, given the changing character of the student population, given the cost spiraling, given the whole question of who should have access to higher education, and given obviously the question of the uses of technology. So my contribution in this conversation is really in a sense to remind us of the necessary integration of the civic, which I mean by that, and the eudaimonic, along with the epistemic and this issue of the value of work and worth of contribution, to remind us of the interplay of those, so that when I think about what you've done about thinking about learning context as recognizing that learning is not a descriptive term but a relational term, suggesting a relationship between agent, learner, and something other than agent, whatever it be, a proposition or a community. But the point of that is to recognize that inherent in the nature of what we mean by learning is a relationship with what is beside oneself, what is outside of oneself, and the responsibility we have as learners to recognize the integrity of that. In that simple sense, it's a recognition that the civic, what I mean by civic, is in terms of engagement with other. That every character of learning, whether it be learning that something or learning how or judgment, is in effect a relational concept of putting learner in relationship to other. In that sense, that notion of broad notion of civic, every experience of learning is in some sense inextricably connected to a civic, to a responsibility to attend to the integrity and purpose of what's other. And so in that general sense, every course within the institution can be civic in fundamental ways. It can raise questions about what that relationship is be. As I mentioned in the video, a biochemistry course can be civic insofar as it attends to such questions as, why are some research programs supported and others not? What is the economic drive that obliges us to consider certain methodological inquiries and not others? A play dealing with sexual boundaries is as civic as Shakespeare's Lear, in the sense of it deals with the dynamic of the relationship between agents. In that broad sense, every educational experience has a civic dimension, and it's in understanding the correlations between coming to understand or coming to know and what is other than oneself, and the responsibility you have when you do so in recognizing your own self-worth, your own identity, your own sense of flourishing, and how epistemic experiences of particular sorts magnify that appreciation of dimensions of well-being. So I see these issues as all part of a whole.
Thank you, Don. Let me throw this open to everyone and ask the question if we can start to develop each from your own perspectives, kind of a sort of a lexicon or an inventory of what do we think are some of the features of a person, say, who has been educated in a way around the interplay of the kinds of things Don's talking about, the civic of thinking larger than yourself, also being prepared to engage in work and a sense of well-being. How can we start to talk about that skill set in ways that honors that fullness? Mimi, would you like to start us off there?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I really appreciated Don's framing of civic in this broad sense of social connection and shared purpose, because that's very much in alignment with a lot of that work that I've been doing with a somewhat younger age group, teens, looking specifically at their technology practices, and a model we've been developing around connected learning, which is investigating how young people are developing these dispositions towards not only getting good at something through these, networked and social relationships and these special interest groups that they're connecting to online, but also developing the capacity to work with others, find their place in the world, develop an identity as somebody who is a contributor to a shared project or shared culture. That these kinds of experiences we found have been incredibly important for young people to not only develop skills and knowledge, but to really be able to apply those skills and knowledge in a way that makes a difference in a world and makes a contribution to the world. And I think the progressive values that I'm hearing articulated around this table, it's really about those long-standing progressive values of education being seamless with life, but a lot of times our educational systems, particularly in the younger grades that I'm looking at, are assuming that application of skills and knowledge is easy, or that it's going to happen naturally, whereas we find in the learning sciences that application, that translation, the building of real social capital is actually incredibly difficult. And I know we're going to be talking about the technology pieces later in our conversation, but I do think that the new networked environment that younger kids are already being immersed in has incredibly strong bearing on how we might look at these civic opportunities broadly conceived.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Randy. I want to pick up on something Mimi said about the way our education systems work and how hard learning and development is, because I think a fundamental skill that we should be working on with our students, we should be working on in our institutions, is coming to be able to act within uncertainty. I think education, K-12, but also colleges and universities spend a lot of time sort of putting students in boxes and giving them very limited choice. And so they're very comfortable acting within prescribed boundaries. And it seems like the future is going to be full of opportunities where we don't know everything we need to know. And we need to be able to act and have the skill to act and the knowledge to act. And I think that recognizing, too, that the uncertainty we have can come in different ways, like Don is talking about. You know, you could have cognitive uncertainty. I don't know something. Or you could have skills sorts of uncertainty. I don't know how to do something. When people talk about higher education and the future, often they talk about that kind of uncertainty. You need to learn to program in languages that haven't existed before. I think it's not just that. It's also learn to know things, and then you have to be able to function within some sort of affective uncertainty where I don't know quite who I am in this space, or I don't know who I should be, or I don't know how my values play out in this space. So working on that kind of uncertainty seems fundamental to me.
Yeah. That's very helpful. Mike, would you like to jump in?
I would. I'm interested in a concept that I think is very close to the concepts of uncertainty in various contexts that Peter was talking about, which is the notion of judgment. It seems to me that one of the things one would like to see develop in a person in the course of her education is a growing capacity for judgment, both in the most practical or technical matters and in larger questions of values, of political judgment, and the like. Judgment's a very elusive faculty because it is a capacity which would be very hard to measure in anything that one would think of as a test or the kinds of things we're most comfortable with doing in school. And it's one of those faculties which one can sense that some people have in a greater amount than others. And it seems fairly uncorrelated, maybe even negatively correlated with certain kinds of intelligence, perhaps because enough intelligence tends to bleed over into a kind of arrogance about one's own certainties about things. And I think, you know, if we're going to keep having a future, having people with good judgment is probably a really important part of it.
Well, I want to ask a sort of follow-up, deeper question that I think that builds off all the comments, and including what you just said, Mike. So I'm interested in what's the problem, and the extent to which, I mean, it seems to me that there's sort of two arguments that need to be made around the whole person. One of them is sort of externally, that there's certain external forces that don't quite understand kind of liberal education values about the whole person we're trying to communicate. But another is internally, that it's not just we've always known how to do this, we just have to figure out how to do it now in new conditions. But my question is, are there things about our assumptions inside the academy, or our assumptions about learning that maybe go all the way up through K through 16, that actually get in the way of achieving a kind of learning system inside our institutions that do the things that we've been talking about? And I'm thinking just about a couple of things. For example, narrowly valuing the cognitive, right? Like that's something that's certainly characterized colleges and universities, maybe even secondary schools. Or believing that what happens in college is first you have to get filled up with a lot of content, and then eventually you get to do something interesting in practice. But part of what we're implying here is an engagement with practice right away, or what Mimi was saying, that what youth are yearning for is engagement. So I'm just interested, how would we talk about the things that get in our own way from the things that we're talking about we value, our assumptions about skills or learning?
I'd be happy to jump in on this theme of, the boundaries and applications and our assumptions about transfer. So I think a lot of our cognitivist assumptions that have undergirded a lot of our modes of instruction and assessment rely on this idea that, you skills and knowledge and even dispositions acquired in one setting can transfer to another setting. And the goal of education is to instill in young people these more generalized kinds of knowledge, skills, schemas, whatever the framework that one is subscribing to. And it turns out that increasingly research is showing that it doesn't actually work that way, that not only does the setting of application have to have cultural resonance or shared relationships that bridge those settings, but that the process of mediating that transfer is complicated and requires practice. And that's where I think there's a lot of long-standing issues and sort of theories that have gotten in the way of our effectiveness of doing of educating young people to actually thrive in the world versus thrive in the classroom. And we really know that what it takes to thrive in an academic achievement context and climbing that ladder of opportunity is not the same thing as what helps young people thrive in life. And I think to the external conditions, we're seeing right now a forcing function where those external factors, that idea of climbing that conventional ladder of opportunity, from high school to higher ed to job and career and community readiness, that ladder is breaking down because we're in a different economic and technological climate where higher education can't elevate everybody. It's very different to deliver opportunity in an era of expanding opportunity versus contracting opportunity. So that promise we made to young people that if they did well in school, they'll do well in life, the broader conditions, and this isn't the fault of the educational system because the educational system can only deliver to opportunity that's in that world, that piece is breaking down at the same time that technology, as of others have mentioned, is creating this sense of change and uncertainty so that kids can't expect that the jobs and skills they're training for now are going to be there by the time they graduate. You can't stuff the skills in their heads now. The person isn't that unit that can really just transfer and expect not to be a lifelong learner and adaptive and all of those qualities where kids are growing up in an era of information abundance where getting access to information is trivial, but finding the right problems, developing the right social relationships, these are the things that are really items of scarcity in today's technology ecosystem. So I think the world outside the classroom has already changed at the same time that our theories of learning are becoming much more sophisticated in understanding what it really takes for young people to thrive.
Others who would like to weigh in on some of these disconnections perhaps between the environments in which we would teach people how to thrive outside the institution. Peter?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a word that Mimi used that I think is exactly right, which is about practice. I think too much of what we do in higher education is about acquiring things, and not enough of it. And not enough of it is about practicing things. And the analogy I like to use now is to think about a college as a practice room. Where you're doing the exact same thing you would do when you're on stage in the same kind of setting. It's just the stakes are different. So you can make mistakes, you can risk things, etc. So instead of just having our students do things that make them be better and better at being at school, which is what a lot of what we do now, have them be better and better at doing the sorts of things they need to be able to do later. And I want to connect that to Mike's thing because I'm a historian, and so I'm not making an argument that what we need to do is be putting students in workplaces all the time and having them practice being middle managers or something like that. I think there's wonderful pedagogies like Reacting to the Past that was developed at Barnard, which puts students in moments in the past and have them try to develop and act on judgments that they're making. And so I think you can be practicing these civic things. You can be practicing well-being things, as well as practicing knowledge or skill things.
Anyone else want to weigh in this question? Other things about how we imagine the civic or this largest context?
I'll weigh in. So, I think that there's a tension between training people for specializations versus generality. A liberal arts education, was designed to create generalists, but when you leave school, everyone's looking for specialists. And so there's a tension here in our educational system and also outside of it. For example, a doctor today, a modern doctor, is so specialized for the most part that they can't function without a whole group of other specialists to fill in the gaps that they don't specialize in. That same is true for almost any kind of engineer today, or any kind of scientist, or anyone in any technical field. All of these fields are getting so specialized that you actually have to start specializing in your first or second year of college just to be on schedule for what you would need to know when you get to graduate school or if you go out into the workforce. So this thrust towards specialization is a real challenge to our ideas about education, because higher education, I think there are two kind of big schools of thought about what a higher education is for. One is that it's supposed to train you to think and perhaps train you to teach, and the other is that it's preparing you for the workforce. And I think in our colleges and universities, that isn't very clear. It's not clear what the purpose is anymore. I remember in my own experience, the majority of what I studied would have been much more useful had I been a professor with my career than what I ended up doing. And I think a lot of students today feel this issue of, is what they're being taught relevant to what they're actually going to be doing and what they need. Now, if your goal is to become a PhD and to teach, then that's one thing. But if your goal is to leave the educational system and go out into the workforce, what you need is quite different. And then there's this problem of what we call in the technology field the filter bubble, which is this idea that increasingly we're able to filter what we hear, what we read, what perspectives we're exposed to, for example, by controlling who you connect with on social networks and so forth, to the point where we only see things which support the perspectives we already have. So there's a risk of the filter bubble where, if we go too far in the direction of specialization or of preparing people only for the career they think they want, they may not be exposed to really useful perspectives outside of that. And there's a statistic that now people change jobs many times in their lifetime. So even if you think you know what you want to do, you could be wrong, or you could that could just be one of your many careers. And so there's a tension there of preparing people for a career when in fact they're going to have many careers. So my feeling is that in many ways the higher educational system is your last opportunity to not specialize, and it's very important, at least I think, for at least half of that experience, maybe the first 2 years, to be a liberal arts education that's really focused on generalist skills before you start to specialize maybe in the second 2 years.
Yeah. Did you want to weigh in, Don, on that? You need to unmute.
Did that suffice? Yeah. Okay. Noah, thank you. I'm hoping that you agree that the last part of your comment responds to the first part. For indeed it is the case that not only on the basis of the rhetoric we use, but the evidence that is quite apparent that those who engage in a broader and deeper understanding of the purposes of higher education and are fully engaged in that experience Indeed, we can document not only the future choices they have, but the sense of their own worth in pursuing whatever those choices are. That's not a matter of speculation, that's a matter of confirmation in terms of a whole lot of research that's been done regarding students who've been a few years out and those who've been out more than 10 years and so on. So the presentation you made in your last observation about the importance of challenging convention, the importance of finding ways to break out of the expression of bubble of interest that you might have begun your educational experience with, and if you're not careful, you'll continue that narrow parochial bubble, but indeed to break out of that. And one of the challenges, of course, of the educational enterprise is to create the expectation that you do break out of such a bubble and to indeed provide multiple repeated opportunities that force you to break out of that bubble.
And I think that when we look at the future, thinking about the demands of the complexities of some of the social challenges and technical challenges that are coming our way, the need to even know the difference of when you're in or out of the bubble, and the need to understand when you're in an open stance to the rest of the world or not, maybe one of the most important things that we can continue to be teaching. Let's turn the conversation here to deepen it around specifically the technology challenge, because certainly that future we're talking about is going to be increasingly shaped by not just ubiquitous technology, but technology that's doing a lot of the work that humans have been doing for the last several decades and hundreds of years. So I wonder, Nova, if you could just give us a couple of minutes to kind of set the stage of just from your view out looking at trends around artificial intelligence and computing power, et cetera, what you see that is coming in terms of the future around technology.
Well, we're on the cusp of a really very different world. First thing I'll mention is that at no time in human history have the different generations used such widely different media to communicate. If you look at how high school students communicate and learn, they're using mobile apps. They're not using the web as much. They're not using email at all. If you look at people in their 30s through middle age, they're behind now. We're still using the web and email. And if you look at senior citizens, increasingly they've started to come online, but they're still. So, in no time in human history have the generations been so disconnected from each other. So that would be the first observation. And I think the world we're going into, we'll see them come back together, but it'll be a very different environment in terms of the skills you need to be successful. And I think a lot of it will revolve around being able to handle what we call big data, large amounts of data, being able to assess the quality of data sources. There's a lot of discussion today about students using the Wikipedia to write their term papers, but there are a lot of inaccuracies in the Wikipedia. And being able to critically assess your sources the way a journalist would, to fact check your sources, is going to be a very important skill when you're dealing with knowledge that's coming from lots and lots of places and that hasn't been curated or vetted through the kind of traditional peer review system that one might experience today. So that we're entering a world where knowledge will be crowdsourced from lots and lots of different sources, and where computing technologies will change the game in terms of what skills humans have that are unique and still necessary versus what we get from machines. So in particular, machines are much better at processing large amounts of data, even coming to certain kinds of conclusions from large amounts of data than humans are. And when you're dealing with data that's changing or where it's just extremely complicated, humans just are terrible at that. So I think learning to leverage systems that do analytics, systems that work with big data, systems that do a lot of statistical analysis is becoming increasingly important in a lot of fields. I think statistics and data visualization, or telling stories with data, is becoming a very important skill in the workforce, certainly, and I think that's going to percolate back into the educational system. With regard to artificial intelligence, it is making, that field is making progress. I don't anticipate that, you know, in the next decade or two we're going to have general artificial intelligence that's comparable to a human. That's unlikely. But we will have systems that are incredibly good at doing things like diagnostics, where they're applying logic to large amounts of data, or applying deep learning and other kinds of techniques to try to either solve problems or replicate skills. But these will largely be confined to deductive kinds of thinking. So where deduction is important, I think computers are generally better than humans. But where induction is important, humans are better than machines. And so I think what we'll see is students will need to learn how to use computer systems and data sets for deduction. But for induction, they need to learn innovation. We need to focus on synthesis and teaching synthesis as a skill set. And there's a risk here that in a world that's focused on deductive logic and analytics, we'll forget all about synthesis. It seems like deduction and logic are now the most important skills, but really they're not. Human beings are the inductive part of the system. We need to teach that. We can't forget about that, because humans really aren't as good as machines at deduction, and we shouldn't be focusing all of our education around deduction.
So let me throw that, you know, implicit challenge out. It really harkens back to the question of how does this new world somehow come in conflict with the way that we've structured our educational systems. How does this changing technological world, how is that changing the game of the skill set related to liberal education? Mike, do you want to weigh in on that?
I would like to. I think the point that Nova was making near the end, I'm not sure I would use the terms deduction and induction, although I take the point. I mean, I think actually a lot of the big data stuff is induction. That is, you're not deducing any truths out of those data. You are following certain kinds of rules in order to infer from the data, which is, I think, is induction. But really, you're talking about applying human judgment perspective and a variety of things that don't seem to be. It seems to me with computers, we should learn never to say computers can't do X. We should just say they can't do X yet, because they're doing a lot of things we never thought they could do. A colleague of mine, Dick Murnane, an economist in the Harvard Ed School, has written with Frank Levy a book called The New Division of Labor, which is actually an attempt empirically to figure out where humans, in the way things are currently, are productive, and what things computers find it most difficult to match humans in. And I think the big thing that they've identified is what's called solving novel problems, where you can't rely on a computerized routine in order to produce a result. In fact, a great example of a novel problem is, what do you do when your computer breaks? There's nothing in the computer manual that tells you what to do when the computer isn't working, and you need to use all your ingenuity and wiles to try to go after it. The other thing I think that computers yet don't have any capacity to do, I kind of hope they don't acquire, is moral judgment. Judgments of right and wrong, and what's good to do and what's not good to do. And that's quintessentially something that I think is important for human beings to be good at and to learn to practice at in a variety of settings, some of which may require very high-end subtle thinking, but often what is required is a good, strong disposition to do the right thing.
Mimi, would you like to follow on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I really appreciate the discussion of the kinds of new divisions of labor and the fact that computers are filling in for certain forms of work. I'd like to, in that context, expand our discussion to include not only the in the head and in the person kind of skills and dispositions, but also I think some of the provocations that Don opened our session with about the civic purposes, shared purpose, and community involvement piece, because when we look at the broader context, not just cognitively or skills-wise, that these new technologies are opening up, but the changes in our social ecology and our spaces of opportunity, I think it's really clear that what it means to grow up and thrive in an era of abundant social connection where knowledge and information is cheap and free is quite different than an environment that had a very different sort of social ecosystem. And I think that in talking to a lot of young people, it is really clear that some of the things that have been really life-changing and transformative on the part of educational interventions and opportunities are not necessarily about, well, certainly not the memorization and the sort of rote notion of knowledge and skills, and maybe not even about the specialized skills and so on, but are pretty fundamental in the world type of things, like finding a faculty mentor who inspired them or who connected them to an opportunity, the ability to apply what they've learned in the classroom to an out-of-school setting, which requires a particular kind of mediation. So it is about that moral, the judgment, which was mentioned already, the ability to pick the right problem, mindfulness, what you should be paying attention to, who you should be paying attention to, in an era where that isn't going to be dictated to you up front. And I've talked to young people a few years out of college who, say they majored in political science or they majored in the humanities, and they didn't necessarily acquire the skills that were making them job or community ready. But, actually after school, they are going online and engaging in these increasingly sophisticated kind of learning systems that have let them acquire skills in graphic design or computer programming or web development pretty quickly to apply to that workforce readiness and specialized skills piece. But they really felt that higher education gave them that broader set of social relationships, cultural capital, and other things that enabled them to navigate the space of opportunity in a new way. And so I think, what my colleague Howard Reingold has been describing as things like craft detection, network know-how, attention management, these are the sorts of skills and dispositions that really differentiate young people who, of course they've acquired the basic literacies and things that we really require our K-12 system to impart, but these higher order capacities in a network world are really, really critical to success, I think, in a rapidly changing environment. And I think it's not just about the jobs piece, but really about thriving in life, the fact that contributions to society might not be about economic value, but about contributing to culture. We see kids, creating YouTube videos and contributing to shared causes and so on. None of that has to do with the money piece. And young people are having those opportunities to contribute to society much earlier in life because of these networked environments. And I do think that, the recent Gallup Purdue poll that came out about, they interviewed thousands and thousands of people about how their college experiences related to thriving in life, and they really confirmed that these personal connections with faculty, the ability to engage in real meaningful projects, internships, application of their learning in real life, these are the things that characterized people who are thriving in life, not the specifics of how elite the university was, how expensive the education was, a lot of these things that guide the traditional ranking of educational opportunities.
Thank you. I want to have Peter jump in here in a second, but as you were speaking, Mimi, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about this, it made me wonder if the grown-ups are fretting about a lot of things that feel like binaries or dichotomies to us that to a younger generation feel rather seamless. So that we worry very much that to thrive in a digital environment is somehow very much not the same as working with a mentor, but that actually could be much more seamless to youth culture. That we're worrying about things that, because we're in the process of adapting and it's all that they've ever known. And we can come back to that perhaps.
If I could jump in for just 1 second on that point, I do want to stress that I think Nova mentioned the intergenerational disconnect, that I do think that the involvement of parents and educators and mentors in the young people's space of natural network exploration is absolutely critical to the connection to opportunity and to the real world, adult world piece. So young people are so facile at the network know-how, connecting, geeking out on interests, all of these things. But it really, really is, in our research, the role of a caring adult that is critical for the vast majority of young people in translating those social and recreational kinds of practices to meaningful life opportunities.
Great, thank you. Well, Peter, you've thought a lot about mentoring and mentoring relationships and student transformation. You want to weigh in?
Sure. I just wanted to pick up on something that I hear in this conversation that I think is fascinating, which is the old folks like us tend to see these things as threats. You know, what are computers going to do that we used to do, or when are they going to take our jobs, or all this sort of thing. And that's appropriate and it's legitimate. I also think there's an immense opportunity to say to young people, to say to ourselves, okay, computers and networks are able to do things they didn't used to be able to do. What is our purpose? What is the thing that I uniquely can contribute right now to my community or to my world, right? And instead of just focusing on narrow economic things or that, and say, what are the connections I need to make? What are the things we can do together that computers can't do, or at least can't do yet? And so I think there's a great opportunity here, instead of approaching this from a place of fear, but to approach it from an opportunity and say there's business we used to have to do to keep society running that we don't anymore. And that's awesome. Let's focus on higher things.
Yeah, let me throw that out to everyone, because that's really a turn that we're very eager to make. I mean, in this series, one of the really the fundamental question that we're asking is, what is actually possible now that was never possible before? Like, what version of liberal education, we want to call it that in the broadest sense, what version of liberal education is possible at this moment in history that was never possible? Not just, can we keep liberal education alive despite everything that's happening? So let me just throw that out. Are there other ways, to build on this, to think about what are the opportunities that have never been available to us, both at this moment where the learning sciences, our attention to mindsets and the broader purposes, and the technological capabilities that are creating the, kind of offloading and the surplus. What are some of the opportunities that are available to us? What's a really positive vision we could be working toward here?
Well, I'd be happy to jump in. I know I've been taking a lot of airtime, but I really appreciated Peter's intervention here. And, I think in connected learning, we really talk about the new technologies as an opportunity to realize the historical aims of progressive education in new ways. The starting point really has to be not that kids are distracted and narcissistic and all of those things that we're concerned about, but the starting point has to be that the abundance of knowledge and social connection is a good thing, full stop. And from there we can say, well, how can we manage that abundance in ways that are most productive and that take advantage of this abundance in ways that are productive? And whether it's social media or new video, new digital production tools or interactive technologies and learning analytics, all of these things, I think keeping the core values that all of us are talking about here of the educational enterprise in view enables us to see those as new kinds of stages, new kinds of opportunities for kids to exercise creative production, voice, civic engagement, and the most activated young people that we talk to are exactly doing that. They're the kids who are starting Facebook causes, who are creating incredible works of creative production, being able to share them to incredibly diverse publics at a very young age, the ability to share and circulate and build on each other's work and give feedback to one another. These are dispositions that young people are cultivating very organically. And I actually think the huge barrier is the fact that institutionally, it's not even just the old fogey effect, which I know gets talked about a lot, but it's actually our institutionalized practices that, like assessment, like sorting, like the bundling of accreditation and learning and assessment and these packages that really aren't working for people who really want to connect with young people. These are actually the things that are getting in the way of us really engaging with these opportunities. And the reality, and the research really shows this, is that just because those opportunities are there doesn't mean that young people are taking advantage of them in ways that are really, really productive. And so it's not enough to just wave our hands at the 10 kids who have done amazing things on our own, but really to look at the other 90% of kids that need incentives, guidance, institutional supports in order to take advantage of this opportunity. And it is the responsibility of our educational institutions to guide them to those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some interesting examples that, to me, maybe are signs of what's to come. And one of them is a project that came out of MIT called NuVu, or NuVu, N-U-V-U. That's newviewstudios.com, I believe. And it's a studio-based learning approach for high school students, which basically models how architecture students learn. And so it was actually a bunch of MIT architecture students who finished their master's and PhD program there, and they decided to teach studio-based learning to high school students, not in architecture, but in every field. And it's in Boston. It's a very interesting program. It's extremely innovative what they're doing there. But I think in general, project-based learning, where you're in a group of people building something or making something, tends to be retained better and gets I think gets more passion out of students. And I think there wasn't enough of that when I was in college. I think that certainly in the workforce, that's what you do all the time. So it seems to me that's how education ought to really model itself going forward, and I think it's really an interesting approach that everybody should learn about.
It occurs to me as we're talking about this that really the social learning and creativity, and perhaps also kind of authentic work or project-based learning, kind of pulled together the last few comments. Part of this presenting symptom is that those things are very much alive out in this new ecology, and for the most part have been kind of disconnected from at least the foundations of, say, higher education. That tends to be not social and not creative in most of its guises, and that leads to a kind of disconnection. And it feels like that's one of the things that we're advocating for, is the need, and the irony of that, I think, is that experts in a field, even academics, I don't know why I say even, but academics, experts, people who create new knowledge, actually create new knowledge in a very social context and often in a very creative context. So it's not even that this exists outside of academia. That kind of expertise, knowledge creation, communities of knowledge creation are often both very social and very creative. But our introduction to the world of learning tends not to come through that social and creative context, but through a much less community-oriented context. Feels like we're arguing for kind of a reconstruction of that if we're going to take these higher purposes seriously in combination with a new ecology. Don, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, I just want to correct that.
Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
Sorry, let me just correct that link. It's nuvustudio.com, not studios.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Don, did you want to comment?
I did very briefly as a sort of an add-on to some wonderful remarks that have just been made. But I was thinking about this notion of both institutional obligation to create opportunities and the insistence that we continue to have, I think, in encouraging agency on behalf of learners. It reminds me so vividly of the quote I'm fond of using of Benjamin Mays, who was Martin Luther King's mentor, that the particular educational experience he had in 1920 didn't liberate him. He emancipated himself. But he went on to argue that the most important thing that the educational institution does is creating a context, a set of opportunities, which allowed him to choose to be free. And it seems to me that that notion of the crafting of opportunities, multiple repeated opportunities that are built within a learning environment, that are built in terms of a learning culture, are absolutely essential, and it's a prima facie responsibility of the institution. But it's not going to generate the participation by students in those opportunities unless we really emphasize the expectation we have of them to be indeed empowering them with their agency. And I think that's often missed in our sense of what we're trying to create in either a current or a future educational environment. We have to work at both of those, and there are ways to get at both of them. One of the interesting things that seems to me in this conversation that had just occurred to me is that one of the interesting notions that we might attribute to higher education is the cultivation within learners of a kind of meta-level epistemology, unlike machines, an awareness at a meta level that they are engaged in learning, that indeed they're aware of the support systems, the community engagement, that on that level above knowing that something, or above the level of acquiring a set of skills, or even above the level of putting action connected to what they know, or making a judgment on the basis of values to which they have aligned themselves, that there is that meta level awareness that indeed they are engaged in something that forces them to be beyond themselves, forces them to understand that there's a structure that is supporting them in the enterprise of learning.
That's an excellent way to turn to our third challenge around equity, because I think when we're talking about empowerment, or as Mimi referred to it as the other 90% of youth, etc., is what we're talking about something that is a sort of democratic vision? I mean, is there one of the opportunities here is to say finally leverage a kind of vision of this kind of holistic education at greater scale or in a much more equitable way? Because certainly for some students, for a small number of students in the most privileged universities or colleges for many years, something like this has been happening in uneven amounts, but that's kind of what residential universities are all about, residential liberal arts colleges. But can we expand the vision? How do you folks think about the question of equity and whether or not this can be a vision that is broadly applied, not just even to all students in higher education, but to all the students that are not yet in higher education we feel ought to have access to higher education? Peter, you wanted to jump in before. Can you bridge off?
Well, let me see if I can bridge this, and I think maybe it works. I want to connect some things Don's been saying to some things everybody's been saying, but going back specifically to Mimi's, some of the work Mimi was talking about, which is, I think, one of the problems in higher education right now is that the work students do is so private. And if we could have expectations that the work, if we could help students have the expectation that their work is going to be public. They're going to be doing the cool things Mimi was talking about. They're going to be creating social knowledge, and they're going to be showing people what they know and what they can do. That changes expectations for them. It changes expectations for us of what they're capable of. And one of the barriers, I think, to access is the widely held view that only certain students are capable of doing certain kinds of work, right? And when you see students who are doing amazing work, I see that as a faculty member. But nobody else does until graduation, when they walk across the stage and say, I didn't realize they were summa cum laude or whatever. So why can't we take advantage of some of these technologies and have students be showing us throughout their time in higher education what they're capable of, knowing that it's not going to be perfect all the time. But what they're doing is they're setting the best students, and the most creative students are setting the bar for everybody else, not just on our campus, all over. So I can say to my students, why aren't you doing what those kids at wherever are doing? And they can say that to themselves. And so it's not just faculty as mentors empowering students and encouraging them one-on-one. It's the work itself and the capacity of their peers that's inspiring students to act.
Mimi, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think that focus on publicity or making authentic contributions and peer learning is really, in our work, been shown to be not only engaging but also cultivating of skills and knowledge and achievement in ways that are really leveraging these new opportunities. I think to tie back, again to the equity point, Randy, I really appreciated your just signaling that, yeah, these progressive education has been around for a long time for relatively privileged groups, but the question is really, what role is this technology going to play in either broadening that gap or narrowing it? So again, not to reduce it to economic outcomes, but really this question of whether young people can have these experiences of progressive education, meaningful contribution in the world more broadly. And I think that really is the critical question. And even though I'm a huge proponent of leveraging today's technology opportunities to help make progressive education available to all young people, we have the opportunity with these tools to deliver these connections to the real world. It can be as simple as putting a podcast on the open internet or having a writing class be about blogging to publics. It's very low cost now, and to create those connections between the classroom and the world at large, which was very difficult to do in an earlier era. But the problem is that empirically we know that the technology is more likely to create greater inequity, so that as is typical, without really principled institutional and public policy, when you give openly available tools and capacities to society, the already privileged take greater advantage of those tools. And so even though those of us who live and thrive on open network systems may have progressive values, the reality is that it really is showing to confer more advantage to the highly educated and those with a lot of social capital already. So the danger of systems that are very socially driven rather than institutionally driven in terms of achievement and success is that that old truism of it's not what you know but who you know starts to apply with a vengeance. And so you see that, for example, in Silicon Valley, which is a place that's characterized by progressive values, but in the past few decades is actually becoming more exclusionary, less diverse over time because of the particular form of meritocracy that these kind of open, sort of peer-based learning systems are really supporting. And I think that is the real risk, is that, in theory, anybody can take advantage of these networked opportunities. In reality, it starts coming down to who is most strongly identified with the culture, who has the best social connections. And I think that, again, is the role of our educational and public institutions to respond to those changing conditions in ways that are really trying to address the opportunity gap. And I'll just mention one more thing, which is, again, with higher education, we know that everybody is across the class spectrum is tending to go into college at higher rates. But of course, the more privileged kids are going at even higher rates. So the equity gap is continuing to rise, and it's becoming, if anything, more of an arms race rather than an equalizing function. But the gap is even bigger in out-of-school learning. The growing equity gap between the expenditures and access that privileged families have to enrich learning, specialized learning, interest-driven learning. The richest families in the country have tripled their expenditures from about $1,000 or about $1,500 a year to almost $8,000 a year that people are spending in enriched learning, whereas poor families are lucky if they're spending more than $1,000 a year. So a lot of this differentiation and opportunity is happening in these more informal and privatized kinds of settings. And again, that's where I think our institutions really have to respond to the opportunity gap here.
Mike, did you want to weigh in?
I just want to make explicit something that I think is implicit in what Mimi was just saying, which is that you can't talk seriously about having genuinely equitable higher education without dealing with the spectacular inequity of elementary, secondary education, and preschool education, which is just creates overwhelming problems for students who arrive at college with quite inadequate preparation. And we should do all we can in the near term to help people deal with that problem. But we also need to have large enough minds to think about getting kids who are just being born ready for college, which means we need a longer telescope to think about the nature of these problems.
And at least in the interim, be very mindful as we are constructing higher ed environments that people are coming in with very differing levels of their comfort with certain kinds of new learning and needing to at least address that. Other people want to weigh in on or anybody want to come back around to this, the equity issue and other dimensions? Responses to people who say some, this is good for some students, but other students, they just need to learn the basics, etc. Don, did you want to weigh in?
Thanks. I was just going to add, Randy, that I think the issues of the values of diversity and equity, clearly liberty of agency, can be woven through all of the fundamental core purposes of higher education. But I was going to add something that might perhaps lead to another step in this general conversation, and that is that for many people, and all of us have had the experience, that for many people there's a real dismay with any valuing of higher education. They don't see higher education as particularly valuable. They don't see the notion of being an authority particularly valuable. And if higher education is in fact putting authorities in front of students, that doubles the sense of disvaluing of higher education. And either or not we would be going down the right path if we were trying to encourage the greater valuing of higher education, if we took the line that we could offer it at less cost, or if we took the line that we can do it efficiently with technology, or if we took the line that higher education, and we'd value it because it's uniquely poised to address the most fundamental and pressing questions that we face, be they environmental, be they world population issues, be they resource issues, be they the dimensions and boundaries of community issues and cultures, whatever they happen to be. Within our cultures, within certainly our social organizations, higher education is uniquely poised to address those, and perhaps not only uniquely poised, but perhaps singularly in the sense of there are no other organizations or structures on the horizon that could do so. And so perhaps the line of, in effect, increasing the valuing of higher education by certainly the general public at large might not be to emphasize technology, might not be to emphasize, and in fact the technology is accommodated by younger learners very well, and not necessarily by the issue of we can do it by cutting out all the fringes, which are understood as fringes and not essential. Maybe that's not the right route. Maybe the route is to go after this unique posturing of higher education. Thought.
Randy, can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
And just, I agree completely with Don. I just wanted to add one more layer to that, which is thinking about not just society in general, but who our students are and who our students might be. I mean, it's very different to say to an 18-year-old or a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old, you know, if you come to my school, you'll be able to take a year or two of developmental work so you're ready to start doing the kind of esoteric work we do here at this university. Please come, right? Versus saying to them, look, there are really big problems in the world. There's things like climate change. There's really big issues in this neighborhood where you live. Or there's these amazing opportunities with technology or with other things to create, right? We can help you do that. So you want to learn how to tackle the biggest problems that face you, us, whatever? Come on over here. And that's what we do. I think that's a much different argument. It's a much different values argument. It also requires us actually to think about how we structure our curriculum and what we actually do with students. But I think that is where, to use a phrase I don't like very much, that's where the value proposition in higher education, and not just writ large to society, but to specific students. There's a wonderful book by someone named Sharon Parks called Big Questions, Worthy Dreams. And one of the things Sharon says in that book is that students come to college, by and large, wanting to address big questions. Think about moral judgments and moral issues and their place in the world, and then we don't give that to them, so they disengage with us.
Yep.
And she says it's such a huge opportunity we miss.
Mimi.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with the importance of not letting the technology conversation become a question of efficiency and cost cutting, and particularly of content delivery, right? So again, to bring it back to the equity issue, once you reduce the value proposition of higher education to content delivery, then you're also in the position of starting to suggest that that is a sufficient replacement for kids who can't afford the other stuff that we're talking about, as long as they have access to lectures on the internet and the content. What, you know, a lot of less progressive approaches to education would see as the value proposition of higher education. I don't think anybody around this table certainly sees it that way. And so the technology issue is really bringing to a head what our core values are as educators. And I think if we can reconnect with the things that Don is really suggesting as the value proposition of education, and you know, those of you who are involved in the institutional practices and shaping of policy, it becomes really, really critical that those questions, I think, stay on the fore, and that it really doesn't become a question of content delivery, but is really about the purpose and issues.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Mike, would you like to weigh in?
I certainly don't think that the technology discussion should be all about cost by any means. But I do want to make 2 points that are relevant to cost. One is, at the elite institutions of the country, there are spectacular amounts of extravagance and waste, which are extremely hard to justify in any way I can see. And they may not have much to do with technology, but there's no responsible reason for the kind of spending that, and I've been inside of some of those institutions, so this isn't just an abstract assertion. And we get a kind of arms race in amenities, which seems to me wasteful and seems to me to make life more difficult for less affluent students and for less affluent institutions. The other thing is a lot of big institutions, Cal State type institutions, have been driven by cost pressures to some really pretty weak instructional practices, including extremely large classes, not just in introductory sections, but further up the line. Very unimaginative, teaching a lot of processing. Some of that stuff might be done more efficiently and without any loss in quality compared to what people are actually experiencing with technology. And I don't think we should make the best the enemy of the good. If we can improve now the educational opportunities that some students have that are impeded by excessive cost.
Yeah, Mike, I would agree with you. I would totally agree with you on that point.
Yeah, I mean, getting beyond sort of the binaries that it's either one or the other, but that we can have both and. It's really what is actually just driving the use of, say, courseware and other kinds of adaptive learning. Is it seen as a substitute for the kinds of things we're talking about, or is it seen as something that's actually getting us to a vision? Agree. Well, let me, as we make the turn for our last few minutes here, let me throw out a question to all of you then, to sort of, pull together and galvanize kinds of things we've been talking about. What's at least one way for each of you that you see that a holistic vision of kind of skills and outcomes can have an impact on how the university should be reinvented? Like what would be at least one thing that you would want to start with if you were reinventing the university? It could be from scratch, or it could be with an already standing university. You can take your choice. That you think is essential to the kinds of things we've been talking about. If you're trying to cultivate the kinds of skills or outcomes that we've been talking about and the conditions we've been talking about, what's at least one thing that you would privilege? Who would like to take a whack at that to start? Don? Wait, Don, you're muted.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll just start with might be the expected from me, and that is that what I would privilege is this opportunity to generate a chorus of commentary from within higher education, repeated vigorously from without higher education, about the full case that can be made regarding the purpose and value that it promises or could promise. I think if we could do that, we have a chance of at least entering in a significant way the prevalent conversation. And if we can do that, I think we can lead to a set of changed expectations, which I think will, to be met, will force changes within higher education.
Okay. Mike, do you want to offer up something?
Well, this is a perfect bookend because I'm going to entirely pick up the other end of things by talking about incremental change within institutions. I think actually teachers underestimate in many cases both how much work it would be to revise their practice modestly in the direction of more interactive and the other kinds of things we've been talking about. They overestimate how hard it would be, and they underestimate how rewarding it is. And Dan Bernstein from Kansas, I think, talks about paying attention to the dosage effect, that it may be that just a little bit of interaction makes a lot of difference, and that once you start experiencing it, it may become a little bit addictive to do that in your classes. So that's the opposite way if you want to spread the word from getting the country on the same page and pushing for it. But probably both would be valuable.
I guess to build on the incremental versus disruptive innovation piece, I totally agree with Mike that every little bit counts and it's not as hard as you think, and that it's important not to overwhelm faculty with thinking that the institution has to be completely overhauled. And we see that even very small changes in practice, like just a faculty member who connected with a student interest, who had a project that was relevant in the real world, to have, you know, a maker space or project-based learning, these things which seem incremental on the part of faculty or educational institutions are life-changing on the part of young people. So it's really important to remember that things that may seem at the margins of educational practice, for the kid who's experiencing that one opportunity that really made a difference in their life, it changes their whole trajectory. So I want to underscore that, but I can't reduce it just to one. So I want to actually put out a pie in the sky, more systemic change piece that really comes from my work with teenagers, to say that the admissions criteria of higher education and elite institutions in particular are creating so much suffering on the part of high school students. And if you really believe in progressive values of education, the admissions criteria need to reflect that. And this total arms race of achievement that the admissions criteria for elite and selective schools is creating for young people is destroying their childhood and their ability among a certain sector of society of children to explore, tinker, take risks, be creative, all of those things that we have been talking about as values and needed dispositions for young people to thrive. You know, the admissions criteria are actually shutting down the spaces for young people to be able to do that. And I think it is really the responsibility of institutions of higher education to look critically at how those kinds of practices affect young people's learning and development in the earlier years.
Very interesting. Others want to weigh in? What would you do? What would you change?
I'll jump. I want to take everything everybody else has said, and also, more fundamentally, maybe create more spaces for students to lead us in these ways, right? Create space for students to turn the curriculum into the sorts of things they would like it to be, and to take advantage of the many opportunities they have, and sort of show us, in some ways, what our higher education could and should be, right? I think too much we think about doing this. What we do in higher education is we teach to them instead of doing things with them. And so that kind of reorientation and saying, yeah, the faculty have to be involved and the institution has to change in certain ways. We have to think about admissions, we have to think about purpose and expectation, but we also have to create space for students to make the education their own and make it really meaningful. And I think too often right now we put too many constraints around students in our institutions.
I think we should start to teach innovation. And that innovation is such an important skill. It's really a set of skills, and it's also really important to the economy. And it's important in academia as well. But it isn't really being taught specifically as a discipline. And I think maybe it's time that we start to do that, and do it through experiential learning, through studio-based learning, or other approaches where students are asked to innovate rather than just absorb facts or memorize or do well on SAT tests in high school, for example. And in college, the same thing applies. You know, there can be a tendency to have humongous reading lists, massive exams, and tons of memorizing. And that's not really preparing people for the real world. I think innovation is a really important skill for this century that we're starting, and should be taught.
Nova, I'm interested in just your perspective on what are the constituent skills. I mean, you referred to innovation as a skill, but presumably it's a collection of skills. What are the skills that you associate with innovation from your perspective, working in you know?
Well, first of all, innovation is generally collaborative. So working on design projects with groups of other people who don't necessarily fit well together, but have to work together to solve problems or to create new ideas or inventions. You know, that's very important The skills involve, I think, fundamental principles of design, learning how to gather requirements and then design generations of solutions, learning to iterate and learning to do that effectively to create generations of solutions, almost in a evolutionary approach, and then to take the best ideas and combine them, learning to think and solve problems synthetically instead of simply by recalling facts or solutions that other people have created. So it's really about fostering creativity in a group setting and learning how to create generations of ideas following a more Darwinian type of approach to inventing solutions.
It sounds like you could almost be talking about a liberal education when you put it like that.
Well, except that they didn't do that when I was in college. Instead, we had to read, for every class 3 or 4 books a week, memorize, thousands of facts and pass tests. That wasn't innovation.
Yeah, no, point well taken. Well, we're almost out of time. I want to give Don a last word here in a moment. But I thank you very much. We've really pushed the conversation in very interesting ways, and I think part of what is happening in these conversations, and today was just a perfect example of it, is really starting to surround a space that almost gives us kind of design specs for where we want to go, whether it's incrementally or in some larger sense, which is the challenge of trying to create environments that we are partially shaping and controlling that are empowering students to learn outside those environments. I mean, that's always been the challenge of the university, but it seems that we have a kind of reset on that challenge. How do we create conditions that help students learn so that they don't need those conditions in order to learn for a lifetime? And but the way we do that is actually just a slightly changed set of conditions here, including that I think we have to, as I think here you're saying today, rethink the interior of universities to be more like some of the exterior without losing some of the essential qualities of universities that make them a kind of sanctuary space for that kind of development. And at the center of that, I think, is what I hear people saying is really this empowerment of the learner, kind of agency growing out of that environment. The kind of meta-learning that Don talked about, meta-awareness, holding that at the center of our design. So Don, would you like to just say something just as we wrap up here?
Well, I certainly can't summarize some of the excellent points that everyone was making. I simply welcome the opportunity to be a part of the conversation, and I also have made a note to make sure that I continue to contact each of you and find ways that I can ask for your help in the kinds of work that we're engaged in doing this effort to really champion the full purposes of higher education. And I would simply echo your last comments, Randy, with sort of 2 emphases. One is that what you were describing as the conditions that we see for higher education is really one way of characterizing the fundamental obligation we have as educators and as representatives and agents in higher education. As I mentioned earlier, I think everyone concurs that not only do we have this special opportunity to view the future in the way you've just characterized and to work towards achieving it, but I think we have both an educational and perhaps one would claim a moral responsibility for doing so. Otherwise, I think we fail to meet the special character of what has driven us to be involved in education. I think at some level, every one of us thinks of ourselves as being an educator, and what we mean by that has all to do with a commitment to the interest and development of our students. And that is not some sort of altruistic, emotionally motivated concern. It's a fundamental nature of what we think is important about the power and future of higher education.
Thank you, and we will take this foundation into our next several episodes. Our next time is to talk specifically about the kind of environments that would respond, physical and virtual, to the kinds of things that we've been talking about, and then after that to look at metrics. How could we start to talk about the new metrics to be able to get a little more systematic about some of the things we're talking about? Maybe not judgment, but things surrounding the kinds of broad, wider outcomes that we value. And then to look at policy, which raised today some of the principles that should shape policy to keep the whole person at the center, and then ultimately also raised today the strategies that can actually foster change and move the whole system forward. So that whole spectrum is really raised today as we dove into skill sets, and I thank all of you for a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your thought, and we really look forward to continuing this conversation and deepening it. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Randy.